If you've ever panicked about your camera settings right before the first kiss, are getting blurry photos throughout your wedding days, or are scrambling around with your ISO when you're in a dark reception, this video is for you. I'm going to take you through all the settings that I generally use during a wedding day. And this is coming from a wedding photographer who's been shooting weddings from over 11 years. After watching this video, you should understand what your settings should be at every single point of the wedding day. But as a quick disclaimer, keep in mind that lighting changes throughout a wedding day, and wedding days are extremely unpredictable. There's no way I can tell you one single setting for everything, but I'll give you a range of settings that will give you a better idea of what you need for your wedding days. Also, thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. It is the best place online to build your web presence and website. We'll be talking about them later on in the video. To start out, let's talk about all the things you'll want to think about before you start your wedding day. The biggest one being, what camera mode are you going to shoot in? When you get a camera, there is a bunch of different camera modes that you can choose. Manual, aperture priority, shutter priority. Which one should you be using? Now, I can tell you personally, when I first started wedding photography and weddings were too hard for me to keep up with, I chose aperture priority. The reason I like aperture priority is because I control everything from the aperture alone, and everything else is going to set itself. However, the big downside to this is sometimes your camera is going to choose settings that are not in your best interest, and you could be getting bad results because of it. With this in mind, you're going to want to choose to shoot in manual. This is why all professionals shoot in manual, because you get to control everything and you know exactly what you're going to get. So you don't have to pick manual if you want to shoot something else like aperture priority, but you're going to get better results if you're shooting in manual. And if you're not familiar with how to shoot in manual and don't understand the exposure triangle, check out my video right here up above and in the description below that will help you understand the exposure triangle, which will help you start using manual mode. Now that we've chosen the mode we're going to be shooting in all day, next up is, should I be shooting in RAW or JPEG? There's always a huge argument around this subject, and honestly, in my opinion, you can kind of choose whatever you want to. I actually made a video about that in the past, which I'll leave up above. However, RAW is going to give you the best results and the most flexibility. The reason you want to choose RAW is because this gives you the raw ingredients while you're editing your photos. If a photo ends up being too dark, you can actually fix that in post when you shoot in RAW. Whereas when you shoot a JPEG alone, you don't have as many options to fix your photos after the fact. This is the main reason why most professional photographers will always tell you to shoot in RAW. The times when you're not getting the light exactly the way you want it, and or weren't able to set your settings quick enough while taking a photo, you can fix that in post and it's not a problem at all. However, if you're doing it in JPEG, you have no idea what's going to happen and you can't fix things after the fact. So if you're still shooting in JPEG, I highly recommend to change to RAW. However, if you're doing RAW and JPEG, that's okay. But again, y'all can argue about that in the comments below. After we set our image type, now we need to focus on our white balance. White balance is how your camera is measuring the colors that it's seeing while it's taking its photos. There's two main options for this. You can either shoot in auto white balance and let the camera decide what it thinks the colors should look like, or you can shoot in Kelvin and you can decide what the colors are going to look like. With Kelvin, you're basically choosing if the photo should be warmer or cooler, and you'll have to set this throughout the wedding day. Because of this, I choose auto white balance, because there's no time where I want to sit around trying to figure out the Kelvin of my photos all day. However, I do know some wedding photographers who like to set their Kelvin across the board and just take all the photos like that because they like how they can edit with the photos after the fact. With my approach, I generally like to use auto white balance throughout my full wedding day. Cameras nowadays, in this day and age, can handle auto white balance and get you great results. However, sometimes if you're in a room that has a bunch of blue in it or a bunch of orange, it's going to confuse the camera and then everything's going to look wrong. If you're looking at the back of the camera or the viewfinder and everything looks too blue or too orange, this is when personally I would say to switch over to Kelvin and set your settings that way. So for example, if you're taking photos in the fall and your camera tries to make everything too blue because it sees all this orange from all the orange leaves, you'll want to set to Kelvin and adjust it so that it looks right to you in camera. The biggest tip here is make sure that you're looking at the skin tones. If the skin is not looking correct, then you need to go ahead and switch your white balance. Now, obviously, all of this can be edited in post if you've shot in RAW. However, getting everything correct as much as possible in camera is going to help you in the long run. And last but not least, you need to make sure your camera is set to have some sort of redundancy. As a wedding photographer, getting these photos, saving the photos, and making sure you don't lose them is the most important part of our job. If you're not shooting with a camera that has dual card slots, you're doing a disservice to yourself and to your couple. But you have to make sure that those dual card slots are set to take the photos to both of the SD cards in your camera. Generally, there will be a setting somewhere in the save data settings on your camera that you can tell it to back up the photos to both SD cards, not just to a single one. Again, this is the most important setting, and you'll need to make sure you set it on your camera. So those are our most important settings to think about before our wedding day starts. Choose your shooting mode, either in auto type mode or manual. Manual is the best choice. RAW versus JPEG, which again, RAW is going to be your best choice. So always shoot in RAW. Choose your white balance. Auto white balance is usually fine. However, if things don't look right in camera, switch to Kelvin and make that adjustment. And also make sure your camera is set to shoot the photos to both SD cards in your camera. Now that we have our pre-wedding settings, let's talk about the different sections of the wedding day. Starting with our getting ready section, but specifically the flat lay photos and detail photos. Generally at the start of your wedding day, you're going to be in some type of hotel room or Airbnb style room. These generally will have 1 or 2 windows and you should be getting decent light. However, this can range depending on the weather outside and also just the venue itself. We're going to assume that we have a decent looking Airbnb or hotel room with some decent windows and some good light coming in. You'll actually be surprised at what you can get even if there's not that much window light. Now, when I set my settings before I start taking my photos, I like to do it in a process starting out with my ISO as my base. My ISO kind of sets the stage, and then from there I set the rest of my settings around what I'll need based on the ISO. Generally for your getting ready photos, since you're in a room and only dealing with window light, your ISO is probably going to fall somewhere between 200 and 500. Keep in mind, everyone says that ISO 100 is going to give you the best image quality, but it doesn't matter as much as you think. A lot of that old teaching is based on old cameras that couldn't handle as much. Set your ISO where you feel you need it and what you know that your camera can handle. So between 200 and 500 generally is what I'm going to be using inside while I'm doing my detail photos. Next up is going to be my aperture. This is generally going to be stopped down a bit, not wide open on my lens, to make sure I'm getting everything in the details and the flat lay photos in focus. This will range between f2 and f4 at most, but generally it doesn't have to be that high. And last but not least is setting my shutter. Now with details, I know I'm taking photos of still life. Because of this, I'm not as concerned about where my shutter is to stop any motion blur because my subject's not going to be moving at all. So I sometimes will go all the way down to 1/60 to take these photos if I have IBIS. If I do not have IBIS in the camera, which is in-body stabilization if you're not familiar, then I'll sit somewhere around like 1/125, 1/160. It really depends on how steady your hands are. I actually have pretty steady hands, so I'm okay with going all the way down to 1/160 even without IBIS. By doing this, I'm letting in a lot more light, but again, I could introduce motion blur if I'm too shaky. So again, you'll want to be somewhere around 1/60 to 1/160 if there's not enough light. If you have lots of light, feel free to crank up your shutter speed as much as you need. Again, higher shutters stops motion, so there's no reason to be scared of your shutter. Just make it go as fast as it can, as long as your photos are not too dark. These are the settings that I generally use while I'm doing all my detail photos. Again, since everything is of still life, I can kind of be more ranged with the settings, and I'm not as concerned about getting any motion blur at all. Moving right along to getting ready. This is generally when your bride or groom is starting to get dressed. They have groomsmen and bridesmaids around them, mothers and fathers. There's more people in my photos, and now I have to be a little bit more concerned about my shutter speed. Again, starting with my base of ISO, my ISO is still going to be in that same range to 200 to 500 ISO. Again, if it's darker, I will go higher. However, 2 to 500 generally tends to be a sweet spot if I have enough light coming in through the windows. Next up for my aperture, I actually like to shoot wide open in the majority of my wedding days. However, as the biggest tip, if you want to be more safe and make sure your photos are as sharp as possible, you'll want to stop down just a little bit on your lenses. For example, when I shoot with the GFX 102, I love using my 55 f1.7. However, if I really want to make sure that thing is hitting and hitting nice and sharp, I'll stop it down to f2. So depending on what your lens is, stop down just a bit. If you have an f1.4 lens, go to f1.8 or f2. If you have an f2 lens, go to f2.8, etc. Just a little bit of extra stop down on your aperture. Now for your shutter, since you're taking photos of people, generally you want to be around 1/250. This will stop most all motion unless someone's like really just like going at it. So 1/250 is your safe spot. If you go anywhere under that because it's too dark, just keep in mind you're going to start getting motion blur on your photos. If you know your subjects aren't moving much or you're telling them not to move much, you can go down to probably 1/160 in a safe spot. However, again, you're going to get motion blur if anyone starts moving at all. These photos are generally going to consist of the mother of the bride buttoning up the dress of the bride, the groom hanging out with his best man or father, maybe helping him put his tie on or anything of that sort, and then some solo photos of them also getting dressed. It's a pretty low-key moment of the day, and generally you're going to have enough light in those rooms if there's at least a decent window in them. Now, if you don't have good lighting, sometimes I will break out a flash in this case. I generally don't use flash too often on my wedding days before the reception, but if I do need a flash, I'll probably do like off-camera flash, get a trigger and put the flash in the corner, kind of in the same direction as the window to kind of simulate window lighting. But this usually doesn't happen on my wedding days. I generally will have enough light and can shoot the photos that I need to. Now, before we get on with the rest of the sections of the wedding day, let's not forget to talk about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. I've personally used Squarespace for over 10 years now, and it has been a great addition to my wedding photography business. If you're new to wedding photography or you're trying to get into the market, having a website is probably the most important part of being a wedding photographer. Squarespace is hands down the easiest way to build a website quickly and beautifully. Their templates help you get a layout that's going to work for you, and it's easy to customize, so you don't have to have your site looking the same as anyone else's. I've personally customized my site over the years and built it myself, and it's easy to make updates whenever I need to. Speaking of the ease of use as well, there's so many features built into Squarespace that you're gonna have everything you need for your business right here. You have analytics to see who's visiting your website and where from, also how many people are visiting your website. You have commerce options, so if you want to sell digital or physical products, you can do that. You also can sell your own video content if you'd like to, and so much more. So if you want to start taking wedding photography more seriously, make sure to build yourself a website with Squarespace. Definitely make sure to check out the link in the description below for 10% off of your first website or domain and start showing your wedding work online. So now that we've finished up the getting ready section of the wedding day, let's talk about first look and couple portraits. Generally, when you're doing your first look and couple portraits, you're going to be outdoors. In rare occasions, you'll be inside, generally if it's a rainy day or the couple just really likes the venue and wants indoor shots of the venue. This will change your approach very hugely and may introduce flashes. However, we're just going to focus on the outdoor approach to the first look and also couple portraits. Again, in my 11 years of experience, I've rarely found myself taking the portraits inside. However, I would say if you are taking your portraits inside, use the settings that you would be using for the getting ready. It's kind of the same thing. You're going to be looking for window light, and you're going to want to raise your ISO a little bit and set those settings the same way for the getting ready section. So now for our first look and portraits, since we're outside, depending on how bright the day is, you can actually lower your ISO to its base setting. This changes per camera, but generally it's going to be around ISO 100. The range here you'll want to use, depending on if it's a cloudy day or not, is going to be from ISO 100 to at max probably ISO 400. For my aperture, I'm going to be wide open or stop down just a bit. Again, you want to move maybe one spot in your aperture. So again, if you're at f1.7, go to f2. If you're at f1.4, go to f1.8. Just a little bit extra to make sure everything's getting crisp and sharp. And then our shutter speed is probably going to be fairly fast, especially if it's bright outside. This is going to range anywhere from 1/250 all the way up to 1 over 8,000, depending on the sun amount. I think shutter speed tends to be the easiest thing to set because basically if you're not going under 1 over 250, you're going to be safe for the most part. So just make sure it looks good in camera and your photos are not too dark. Set your shutter that way and you should be good to go. Now, generally with our portraits, we love a nice blurry background, and this is again why we're shooting mainly wide open. This is very typical of wedding photography, and if you want that kind of dreamy, wide open, blurry background look, you're gonna wanna make sure that your aperture is as open as possible. So again, adjust where you need to with your shutter, and then keep your ISO as low as possible depending on the light outside. Now, if you have a camera that doesn't have a very high shutter, let's say it only goes up to 1 over 4,000, you can get a variable ND filter to put on your lens to help out with all the sunlight. So again, this goes for like beach wedding days, or if there's no clouds at all, get an ND filter for your camera. So essentially, ND filters are like sunglasses for your lenses, and they'll help you mitigate some of that sunlight coming into the lens so that you don't have to have your shutter so high. I usually don't recommend ND filters for photographers because we're running in and outside very often. However, if you're doing like a beach wedding or it's just super bright outside and your camera can't go very high in its shutter speed, then go ahead and pop an ND filter on there. I'll leave a link to some ND filters down below if you're interested or curious about them. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to answer that. So for our first look in portraits, we have low ISO because we're probably outside, between 100 and 400. Our aperture is pretty much wide open because we want that beautiful, dreamy, creamy look to our photos. And our shutter speed is gonna be as high as we need because it could be super bright outside. After our first look and portraits, we're moving on to the most crucial part of the wedding day, which is the ceremony. Now the ceremony ranges, so let's talk about two different options. Let's do a more modern indoor and or outdoor wedding with nice big windows and or you're just outside. And then the other option is going to be an indoor ceremony, mainly at a church or cathedral. These are very different settings, and it's going to change the settings you'll be using on your camera drastically. Let's start out with the one that most photographers fear, which is the cathedral or church indoor wedding. Now, when you're in a larger church or cathedral, there's usually a lot of rules to taking your photos. This is what makes shooting these so hard for photographers. The first tip I'll let you know is if you do have a cathedral or church wedding, find the officiant and ask them what you can and cannot do. Some churches don't mind and will let you do kind of whatever, whereas others are going to be extremely strict. Let's talk about settings based on a strict cathedral. First, to start out, you're not going to be able to get anywhere near the actual altar where your couple is going to be. So for this, make sure you have a long lens or a zoom lens. You'll want something in the range of 110 millimeters or all the way up to 200 millimeters. This is why so many photographers talk about the 70 to 200. Next up, most of these cathedrals and churches will not let you use flash. This is why you really need to know your camera, its range of operation, and how to set your settings. To start out, let's set our ISO again as our base. This is generally going to be fairly high. However, most of the time in cathedrals, it's actually not that dark. Up at the altar section, there's going to be a lot of lights and kind of spotlights, so it's actually not super dark up there, which is nice. I've come to find that most of my photos sit in the range of between ISO 600 and 1000 or 1250 at worst. But again, when you know your camera's range and how far it can handle the ISO, push it up as high as you need to. But honestly, I don't like going too high over 2000 or 3500. Next up, you're going to be setting your aperture. And again, if you want the most light in your camera, you're going to keep this wide open. I generally will shoot it wide open, but again, if you want your photos to be sharper, stop down just a little bit to f2. And then for your shutter speed, you're going to want it as slow as possible without getting motion blur. So when your couple is walking in, all their guests and everybody are walking in down the aisle, you want to stick around that 1 over 250. However, when your couple is up there and the ceremony is actually happening, you may be able to drop down to 1 over 160 because most of it is just going to be your couple standing there not doing much. Because of this, you won't get too much motion blur. So 1 over 160 is like the risky safe. 1 over 250 is going to be ultimate safe. However, you're not getting as much light into your camera. These ceremonies can be long, so feel free to play around with your settings. But again, when your couple's just standing there holding hands, 1 over 160 is fine. Once the first kiss comes up, they're walking back down the aisle, you want to move back to your 1 over 250 to make sure you get all those photos crisp and sharp and no motion blur in them. Personally, I would say not to worry too much about these church and cathedral weddings. They're actually not too bad, and they're not as dark as a lot of people make them out to be. As long as you know that raising your ISO is not going to hurt anything, and you know the range of your camera's ISO. And when I say that, what I mean is that some cameras, once they hit a certain threshold of ISO, they just get way too grainy and the photos aren't good anymore. So just know what that setting is going to be on your camera. Also keep in mind, nowadays we have the AI denoise inside of Lightroom, which is super easy to use and gives you great results. I use it all the time. So again, don't be scared of high ISO. Let's move on to our ideal ceremonies, which is going to be an outdoor and or nice big windows style ceremony. For this, our settings are going to be much more forgiving. Our ISO can range anywhere from ISO 100 up to maybe ISO 800 if it's a little dark outside. Generally, I'd say ISO 250 to 400 is kind of the sweet spot. You're going to be outdoors, you're going to have big windows, you're going to have a lot of light. ISO lower is going to be better. Your aperture again is going to be wide open. Again, we want those dreamy wedding photos. However, since you're outdoor, do not be afraid to stop down some. The biggest misconception of a lot of wedding photographers is shooting wide open all the time. Stopping down at f2, f2.8 is going to give you better results. And most of the time, the couples want a sharp, non-blurry photo more than they want the blurry background. I've actually heard stories of couples complaining about the blurry background. So again, don't be too scared to stop down just a little bit. And then your shutter speed can be wherever you want it to be. Again, in this scenario, we have good lighting, so our shutter speed doesn't matter as much. As long as you don't go under 1 over 250, you're good to go. You're not going to get motion blur. Ceremonies can be kind of challenging, but as long as you're paying attention to what's happening during the ceremony and making sure your settings are set correctly, they will go extremely smoothly. Honestly, most of the time, you'll just be kind of sitting there waiting for something to happen, especially if it's a longer ceremony. And if you want to see ceremonies in action and or the full wedding day and me shooting it, I have full wedding day videos that I've made before. Definitely check them out right up above. It's going to be a great example of a working photographer actually doing everything, and it'll make you feel like a second photographer following along on the wedding day. Last but not least, after our ceremony is the fun part of the wedding day, which is the reception. Now, receptions can range. They can have more light. They can be during the day. They can be outdoors. But I want to focus on what would be the main type of reception, which is going to be in the evening inside some kind of ballroom or some type of dance floor type room. This is what most photographers are going to be dealing with, and also what makes most photographers scared of weddings. Now, at this point in the wedding day, you're going to be using your flashes. Everything else before we talked about, flashes are kind of like a if and. You don't necessarily have to have them. Like I said again, I get through my whole wedding days without using a flash at all, and I'm getting great results on my photos. However, when we get to the reception, this is when flashes are necessary. Now, if you want to learn more about the details of flashes, you'll definitely want to check out my flash course, which I'll link in the description below. It's a very nice, simple introduction to how to get your flashes working, synced up, and getting great results from them. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. However, I will talk about the settings on my flashes. So generally at your reception, you're setting up flashes, and there's two approaches you can have. You can have your on-camera only flash setup or your off-camera flash setup. For my on-camera only setup, I have a flash on my camera, and this is providing the main light throughout the whole night. I generally will point my flash straight up and put a mag sphere on the top of that flash, use it as bounce flash, and it gives me great results. For my settings on camera, ISO is going to be higher at this point. It's generally going to be darker with lower lights during your reception. However, there will be some ambiance in the room. You're going to have candles, you're going to have wall lighting, and different lower chandelier type of lights. The reason I raise my ISO is so that I can get in some of that ambiance along with my flash. Ideally, I like to set my ISO to 800 to about 1000 at most during this point of the day. My aperture is going to be wide open. Again, it's dark now. I want as much light as possible. Now, you can stop down a bit if you'd like to. However, then you'll need more power from your flash. I actually like to keep my flash power fairly low so that I get more cycles out of my flashes, meaning that it's able to flash very fast, very often. And my shutter speed now is going to be a little different in its rules, mainly because the flash is actually going to be pausing the motion. So I don't necessarily have to sit right at 1 over 250. So sometimes I'll drop down to 1 over 125 or 1 over 60. The biggest thing here is you want your camera to be at least at flash sync speed or lower. So we'll just stick with 1 over 60 with flash. If for some reason you're shooting a reception without flash, which I highly do not recommend, you'll need to stick around 1 over 250 so that you don't get any motion blur. Now with those settings dialed in, now my flash comes into play. I like to use my flashes in manual. I do not like TTL. It takes too long, and sometimes, again, the flash is not going to be triggering as fast as you'd like it to because it's going to use super high power, and then it has to recycle, and it takes forever. Because of this, I will shoot my flash in manual and set it to 1 over 32 or 1 over 16 for the power. This is generally enough flash power when I'm close enough to my subject, which I'm always going to be because I tend to shoot fairly wide. If you're using something like a 70 to 200 and you're trying to shoot very far, you're going to need more flash power because you're further from your subject. So again, ISO 800, aperture wide open, shutter speed 1 over 160, and then flash power in manual 1 over 32 or 1 over 16. Now, my second setup is an off-camera flash setup, which is actually just about the same as my on-camera flash setup. The only difference here is now I have more flashes. I'll put a flash on my camera, and this flash will actually trigger my off-camera flashes. All my settings stay the same. The only difference now is I have off-camera flashes, adding more light in, and I'll change that group to 1 over 16, maybe even 1 over 8, to fill the room up with more light. In my flash course, I go more into how I actually set up those off-camera flashes because there's a bunch of different ways you can place them, and where they are adjacent to where you're taking your photo is actually going to make a huge difference on how that looks. So again, if you want those specific, definitely make sure to check out the course. Receptions honestly are probably the funnest part of a wedding day, and getting these settings down are going to give you great results. I generally love to be on the dance floor, getting really close to my subjects and just getting really nice, natural reactions to the party happening. When you have these flashes set up and have your settings set correctly, it's going to be very easy for you to get these photos. Now, when it comes to wedding photography, what kind of settings do you all like to use on your wedding days? Leave them down in the comments below because I love to see how other people are handling these wedding days. And if you want to see other videos like this where I explain what I'm doing on a wedding day in detail, please let me know. I'll take the time to do all of this for you all, but I need to know that you want to see it. Make sure to subscribe and like and share this video with your other photographer friends. This will let the algorithm know that this video is actually helpful for people so that they will keep considering it and sending it to other people so that all photographers can learn how to shoot a wedding and we don't have horror stories anymore of people taking the absolute worst photos. And again, if you want to see me in action taking these type of photos at real weddings, check out my full wedding day playlist over here where there's hours long of free course tutorials to help you learn more about wedding photography.